So it's a budget that's come just a couple of months before the big Indian elections, unexpectedly so. This budget playing to the gallery, so to speak. But for now, we are being joined by Mr. Amitabh Kant, CEO of NITI Aayog. Mr. Amitabh Kant, thank you so much for taking time out to be with us here on Wion World is One. It's a budget that's been received with a rapturous response, Mr. Kant. But I want to ask you, the big question before this budget was presented was about what the government is going to do about two things. One is the agriculture sector and the other is jobs. How do you think this budget deals with those two?
See, a budget like this presents the big picture. It looks at a new narrative and it spells out how the country should grow up to 2030 and become a $10 trillion economy. But more important than that, I think the budget for the agriculture sector brings in and I think that is the refreshing part of it, that it moves away from farm loan waivers, which distort credit systems, which distort markets, towards a direct benefit transfer in the hands of the farmers, which will give them additional liquidity. And this, to my mind, is a very welcoming change. And this, in the long run, should push states more and more to move away from farm loan waivers, which impact the economy adversely. That's number one. Number two is that the agriculture sector has to be looked at, in addition to this direct benefit transfer, you need to look at the focus on allied activity in terms of dairy and fisheries, because without that, farmers can't double their income. But more important than that, there are limits to, we must understand that there are limits to what the central government can do. The states have a critical role. Agriculture is a state subject. So the markets have to be created, seed and fertilizer have to be provided, irrigation has to be linked up, the backward forward linkages of cold storage, logistics, that's the role where the states have to play in agriculture sector, and that's critical to my mind. Without that, long-term sustained growth in agriculture at high rates will not be feasible. So states really have to get into the act now. The center has done its bit, and now the states have to play a major role.
Right, Mr. Kant, the important part I want to touch upon here is that there were questions about the kind of budget it's going to be, because technically what's required, the basic minimum is a vote on account, and what can happen further is the interim budget. Many are calling this a full-fledged budget simply because some of the most ambitious schemes that have been announced, one is, I would like to take up, is the pension scheme for the unorganized sector. So, to those who are calling this a move away from convention and a full-fledged budget, what would you tell them? And more importantly, talk to us about this pension scheme.
No, the budget is a budget, and I think what the government has done is to spell out its long-term vision. It's brought in a sense of optimism and hope, and more than that, it has spelled out some schemes which it is entitled to do, and it's spelled out the scheme for unorganized sector, a sector which had not been looked at so far at all. So this is a big picture thing of 40 crore Indians working in the unorganized sector, to be able to provide them a pension scheme of up to 3,000 rupees by their paying just about 100 rupees is a very, very progressive step forward. You can't grow without equity, and I think towards that, this is a big step forward.
Apart from the pension scheme, I want to understand, what was the thinking? Because there's clearly a focus on the middle class. There was lots of talk about, discontentment amongst the middle class of this country, be it the hiking of the income tax exemption limit, the deductions, the gratuity, which has been increased from 10 lakhs to 30 lakhs. Lots of focus clearly on pleasing the middle class, the salaried class of this country.
Yeah. So the middle class, India is increasingly becoming we used to call ourselves a bottom of the pyramid society. I think we moved away from that. We are increasingly becoming a middle class society. Soon we'll be a middle class society of over 550 million Indians. And therefore middle class is a very major role to play. And I think the middle class needed relief, which has been provided. And this will put great amount of purchasing power in the hands of both the middle class and the farming community. And both together will really provide increased demand in the economy. And what the country needed was a demand push. So you put incomes, you will see demand, and this will lead to greater production, and this will create a wave of growth in the Indian economy.
And apart from these two things, the other thing that the government seems to be very clear about is the issue of national security, because this is the first time ever the defense budget has crossed the 3 lakh crore rupee mark. It's the biggest ever single time increase as well. And during the presentation, Mr. Piyush Goyal was telling us, telling the world that more will be allocated if required. So defense continues to be the top priority for as far as the government is concerned.
Absolutely. Defense is topmost priority for any country, and for India all the more because we are surrounded by adverse neighbors, and therefore having a high allocation for defense and pushing for greater acquisition is the critical need of the hour. And the finance minister has done well to push for this.
Right. Let me bring out the brickbats, Mr. Amitabh Kant. Maybe you can help us, understand whether they are valid or not. One is that this particular budget, usually 2 to 3 months before the elections, whenever this opportunity has come up before, there is always talk of how governments and finance ministers take liberties, while presenting this budget, because at the end of the day, the elections are the most important thing in this environment, and it's important to keep the electorate happy. So in that sense, for those who are calling this a completely populist budget, one that isn't balanced in terms of its fiscal prudence, what would your rebuttal to them be?
I don't think it's a populist budget. It's a visionary budget. It's a progressive budget. It's a budget which looks at a long-term canvas, a long-term perspective. It spells out the narrative of the government, which any government would do, what it has done in the last 4 years and how it looks at the future. And it looks at a few schemes, and it looks at providing greater allocation of resources to the agricultural and to the middle class of India. I think that's about all.
Right.
The budget is a forward-looking budget.
I ask you this because the fiscal deficit target has been increased from 3.3 to 3.4%. It's an important number that, people across the world, investors across the world look at, financial institutions look at. A country's ballooning fiscal deficit is certainly a problem. It is going from 3.3 to 3.4, and the government has been missing some targets, when it comes to fiscal deficit. So it needs to be brought back down below the 3% mark. So in that sense, concerns and worries do persist.
So I'm not particularly worried about the fiscal number being 3.4. The quality of expenditure is very important. I would have been surprised if, if the revenue expenditure would have galloped in a big way, but a close analysis of the budget really shows that the budget increase has been on infrastructure side, and secondly on education and health, which show an increase of 17%. So if the budget increases on these sectors, then to my mind the quality of expenditure is in the right direction, because in the long run India cannot grow at high rates of 9 to 10% without huge improvement in health and without massive improvement in learning outcomes. That's where quite a substantial amount of additional allocation has gone.
Right. And I also wanted to ask you, interestingly, in this budget, a couple of sectors are picked out as great employment generators. One is the aviation sector, and the other is the entertainment, the filmmaking sector. Two very keen observations from this budget 2019.
So actually, though the word jobs may not be talked about, but the story of job creation is weaved through the budget. whether it was the agriculture sector, whether it was the MSME sector, whether it's the entertainment, civil aviation, highway, or even cutting-edge areas of artificial intelligence, digital villages, all the villages getting digital, or even electric mobility and renewables. These are really the disruptionist areas of the future. And one area which has not been talked about is really the hydrocarbon area, where a committee was constituted and which has spelled out far-reaching changes. Once those changes are implemented, India will see huge cut in imports and massive increase in production of the oil and gas sector in India. So these are path-breaking things.
Right. At this stage, since we are on the topic of jobs, I wanted to also again ask you regarding the NSSO report that created quite a furore coming in just a day before the budget and which pegged India's unemployment growth rate. According to that particular report, it said India's unemployment rate is at a 45-year high. But you did come out and speak about it, spoke about that number and how that number doesn't really tell the real story, far away from it. But if you can help us understand, in terms of the jobs picture in the country, where are we right now and where do you think with this interim budget we can go?
So my view is that you can't be growing at 7.5% without job creation. It's just not possible. You have a whole host of sectors where jobs are being created. Our analysis and several other analyses, including one by McKinsey, including by several independent analysts, reveal that actually we are creating close to about 8 million jobs per year. Broadly, this is a figure which we arrive at if you look at different studies. The number of new entrants in the job sector is also around 7.58 million. But the challenge is that there is a vast number of people who are working in agriculture sector which want to get moving out of agriculture, and we need to provide jobs for them. The other big challenge is not about the jobs not being there, but about the quality of jobs. Wages is a problem. So you have to provide better paid jobs. People are getting jobs, but they are not the jobs which they are aspiring for. So you need to provide high quality jobs for them. And that is a very big challenge. Secondly, the nature of jobs is changing. Instead of government providing jobs, it's the private sector providing jobs. And therefore, you need to really get into newer areas of growth: artificial intelligence, storage, energy, batteries, electricity, electric mobility. All these are new areas of growth, and those are areas of 3D printers, robots, etc., where we are undertaking a very massive structural change by pushing for tinkering labs in schools and incubation centers in colleges. And
Mr. Kant, there was the jibe from the opposition about, how's the jobs, and it's after this budget, it's back to how's the Josh. That's the question that the ruling dispensation is asking all its critics, because this budget certainly cheered the stock markets a lot. Markets are even pricing in a 10 basis point increase in the fiscal deficit to 3.4% and giving a thumbs up despite that, and especially after the income tax exemption was announced. So, India Inc., would you say, is largely happy, particularly the financial markets?
No, I think everyone should be happy that it's a budget which covers all segments of society. It's a progressive budget. It's inspirational. It looks at the farming community. It looks at the middle class. It looks at the unorganized sector. And all in all, I must say that it's a budget which takes a long-term perspective of India, of a 10-year vision, of how to drive it in new areas of growth.
Right. Then I'll have to ask you this. One, there is those who call this a budget that has an idea of where India needs to be over the next 10 years or so. But at the same time, some say that this is a budget that doesn't fully take into account where we are right now, because we are an economy, fastest growing large economy, yes, but one that is faced with many risks and uncertainties, many global headwinds in front of us. So in that sense, do you think this budget has addressed all the possible hurdles that India could face in its growth story going forward?
Well, India's carried out very major structural reforms. It's carried out the GST, it's carried out the insolvency and bankruptcy codes, where We need to ensure that implementation is done quicker and faster. We've brought in the RERA. We've done the direct benefit transfer. We've opened bank accounts. We've pushed the limits of digital payments. And these are very, very progressive measures. So, these are very bold measures which the country was waiting for and which have been carried out in the last 4 years. This has shown the steely resolve of the government to push with radical reforms. And I think, to my mind, if there are risks, we should be willing to take them head on.
Right, and as far as the government's state of mind is concerned, you cannot take away from the fact that, Mr. Kant, that this budget is something that comes less than 3 months before the elections. Every interim budget that comes before an election is invariably colored by the politics surrounding it, by the necessities of the situation of the ruling dispensation. If they want to come back to power, then they do have certain criteria to match up to. In that sense, do you think that this budget, in a sense, follows that convention also of trying to be an extremely playing to the gallery kind of a budget?
Well, I don't look at the politics of the budget. I look at the economics of the budget. And I'm looking at merely the merit of the budget. I'm looking at the expenditure and the revenue aspects of the budget. And I look at the budget as an agent of change. I don't look at the budget as a political budget at all. So I'll be the wrong person to comment on it.
And you would say that this budget, in terms of economics and politics has not taken over economics. This is all about good economics.
This budget is all being about budget as a driver of growth. It's about all being a driver of good economics, and it's all about the budget being a catalyst for growth with the equity.
Another important point I want to touch upon, Mr. Amitabh Kant, is about this announcement Mr. Piyush Goyal made about how we want urban infrastructure in rural areas. A boost to the rural economy is crucial for a boost to the Indian economy, and it's very clear. So one part of it is handling farmer distress, and the other is developing infrastructure for rural India and push up consumption in that part of India.
No, so there's been a huge emphasis on rural roads. The extent of rural road construction has gone up multifold. There's been a huge focus on highways. There's been a huge focus on airport infrastructure. There's been a huge focus on civil aviation, and there's been a huge focus on Sagarmala. All this has led to a quantum increase in infrastructure being created. The whole bonanza about lower oil prices has led to increased outlays for infrastructure sector, and one sector which will drive India's growth in the long run will be this infrastructure sector.
Right, and also, as you've been telling us about this budget being visionary, a vision document was also part of this budget. Mr. Amitabh Kant, it's unlike many other budgets. You have to say it's rather unique in the sense that there is going to be another budget in a few months' time from now, after the elections are over. And would you say that this is a lot of confidence shown by the ruling dispensation that they will be back to continuing where this particular budget left off?
Well, you can't fault this government for being bold and risky and progressive and gutsy. All that are the basic qualities of this government in taking structural reforms. So they've in GST and IBC, all digital payments, all this, they've shown a lot of steely resolve, and they've pushed for this in the budget as well.
Mr. Amitabh Kant, CEO of NITI Aayog, thank you so much for taking time out to be with us here on Wion World is One on this big budget day for India. And meanwhile, we're still being joined with some very special guests. We have Amy Kazmin, South Asia Bureau Chief of Financial Times, joining us live. Amy, thank you so much for taking time out to be with us. First up, how would you rate this budget on a scale of 5 or 10? You pick. What would be your rating?
Well, hi, good evening. Unlike Indian business owners, I don't tend to kind of rate budgets on a scale of 1 to 10. That's
all right, thumbs
really,
up, thumbs down. What's your initial
game,
reading of the budget?
Sorry?
Thumbs up or thumbs down your reading of the budget?
See, I also don't do thumbs up and thumb down. I find this, I mean, my job is to try to analyze and have a look at it. I think the first thing that strikes me about how we're all talking about the budget is that, it really doesn't seem to take full account of the fact that we are looking at a government that is in the final months of its tenure and is facing an upcoming re-election battle. To me, it seems more like an election manifesto. If we are elected next time, we will do this, and if we are elected next time, we will do that. It doesn't. I think it does kind of transcend propriety in a sense, because if they are not elected, then what does that mean about all what's been announced today? And here it's being kind of like regaled as the budget, but in fact there will be a new government. Perhaps it'll be Mr. Modi and the BJP again, or perhaps it'll have a different complexion. And to what extent will the future government be locked in by kind of announcements and commitments and expectations raised by this government? So I find that interesting as an approach to what's going on here. I think the other concern that people, would have, and Moody's, the credit rating agency, has already put something out about this, which is that India does seem to be veering away from the path of fiscal consolidation that had been set out by a number of, through a very elaborate consultative process. And that fiscal consolidation process is important because it addresses issues like long-term inflation. And India has now overshot its fiscal deficit target for several years in a row. Last year, it was supposed to be pared to 3.2% of GDP. They overshot it. This year, they had a target of 3.3%. They're still overshooting it. The next year, if they had stuck to the glide path that Mr. Jaitley had committed to several years ago, they would have been at 3.1% of GDP. But instead, the fiscal deficit is again being targeted at 3.4% of GDP. And we find that Moody's is kind of expressing concern that even this target looks sort of, ambitious, and that there could be a risk of overshooting that. And since India has overshot its fiscal deficit target now, for the last couple of years, and now you're not only overshooting, but you're like relaxing your target. So at least in the past 2 years, they lowered the target and then they overshot it. Now they're raising the target to this year's level, which suggests that the deficit could be higher. I know yesterday there was a very interesting piece from a BJP spokesman talking about the need to kind of rev up the economy, and that fiscal deficit targets are all well and good, but the need of the hour is for growth. And I think we're seeing that this is their view, and this is the kind of vision that they're laying out in this budget.
Amy Kazmin joining us, and clearly then your point here is that this is not a balanced budget. This is but a budget that's meant to woo the voting population of India.
That is certainly how it seems, because, whether most of these schemes will be implemented or not very much depends on the results of the election. And but we do know that, as they said, they are going to put the 2,000 rupees in the bank account of every small and medium-sized farmer between now and the end of the year. 20,000 crores has been allocated that for the current financial year before March 31st. So that will be done quickly. But the rest of these things are very much promises. As I said, when I started, I think it felt to me more like an election manifesto.
Fair enough.
Or of a budget of a government like starting on another full year, when in fact this is an interim budget, and tune in a few months' time for the future budget of the new government.
All right, we started off this conversation by I asked you to rate this budget, or give in terms of on a scale of 5, or give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. You haven't given me neither, but you've clearly stated as to what your take and what you feel about this interim budget. Thank you for joining us here.